U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran continue over a month after the joint campaign first began. Washington now considering a ground offensive with thousands of American Army personnel arriving in the region over the weekend. U.S. President Donald Trump, though, also insisting a deal with Iran could soon be on the horizon. Delano D'Souza has more.
Incoming missiles spotted over Tehran as the U.S. and Israel's campaign against the Islamic Republic continues. The Iranian capital targeted once again as rescue workers tended to the injured in the early hours of Monday morning. As Israel claims it struck missile production sites in Iran's capital, the U.S. president says regime change in Iran has been achieved.
We've had regime change, if you look already, because the one regime was decimated, destroyed. They're all dead. The next regime is mostly dead. And the third regime, we're dealing with different people than anybody's dealt with before. It's a whole different group of people. So I would consider that regime change. And frankly, they've been very reasonable.
Donald Trump told reporters aboard Air Force One the U.S. is weeks ahead of schedule in Iran. The statement comes as Washington mulls a possible ground operation to seize Iran's nuclear stockpile. The mission would be among the riskiest in U.S. history. Trump is also contemplating a takeover of Karg Island, through which most of Iran's oil is exported. He told the Financial Times it's one of the options on the table, adding it would mean the U.S. would be there for a while. The U.S. president threatening to escalate tensions in the Middle East as diplomatic efforts to end the conflict move ahead. Pakistan says talks to end the war would be held in Islamabad in the coming days. For now, Iran continues its retaliation, striking targets in Israel and the wider Middle East. The Islamic Republic has warned that any U.S. takeover of its islands would result in the closure of shipping routes throughout the Gulf. A sign the U.S. president's efforts to remove Tehran's chokehold over the Strait of Hormuz may backfire and send oil prices skyrocketing even further.
As you just heard there, the New York Times is reporting hundreds of U.S. commandos have arrived in the Middle East, joining thousands of Marines and Army paratroopers for a mission that still remains largely undefined. We're going to talk more about that now with Douglas Herbert, who joins me on the set. So, Doug, the first question is, why would the U.S. be sending Special Operations Commandos into the regions if Trump says his goal is to wind this war down?
Well, the most honest answer is we do not know. We do not know what their mission is, and likely many of them do not know yet. It has not been specified. But you're absolutely right. You know, we've been bandying about the number that right now there's upwards of 50,000 American troops throughout the region. They're on ships, at sea, they're at bases on the ground. They're dispersed, and that's about 10,000 more than you would usually have deployed in the region, at least deployed before this war against Iran. So you already have a big surge. And the latest troops, and this is, we have to credit to the New York Times broke this reporting, saying that the latest surge is hundreds of special operations forces. So these are presumably troops who are highly trained to do very precise pinpoint type missions, and, you know, sort of a cut above in at least their expertise in the types of missions and how risky they're than just your conventional infantry troops. And they are joining thousands, precisely about 2,500 Marines who are have already recently arrived in the Mideast, along with 2,500 Army paratroopers. Obviously, all different types of troop expertise for different types of missions. But like I said, if you're asking me why they are there, we do not know. The Pentagon's official line right now, and this is also what the White House communications secretary said, is that they are there in order to keep Donald Trump, his military options open, to give him as many options on that menu as possible, sort of trying to make this look like just any other natural maneuver in a war. But let's not forget, it is a bit eyebrow-raising to the extent that they're surging. There's this escalation. You said escalation versus exit. The escalation is coming at a time and under the decision-making of a president who basically said last June, you might remember, that Iran's nuclear infrastructure had been, quote, obliterated. So presumably they had no more nuclear weapons. And a lot of people who've been observing this war, military experts who know far more than I do about waging a war, basically say that Trump probably went in with a lot of blunder and bluster, flush from his apparent success in the Venezuela raid, so on and so forth, thinking that this would be fast, easy, done and dusted in probably a few days, and that Iran would be crying uncle and go quietly into the night. That hasn't happened. So these forces, if I were a betting man, I'd say, well, these forces are probably there because what Trump originally was planning and what he was betting on just hasn't turned out to be the case. And now he suddenly is desperate, to find that off-ramp, and he needs to be able to find a way to do that as quickly, sooner rather than later.
So does that mean these forces could be preparing for this ground offensive that Washington keeps publicly saying it wants to avoid?
Yeah, look, if there were a ground invasion right now, let's be clear, it would not be on the scale of ground forces on the boots on the ground. It would not be on the scale of, say, what we saw way back in Iraq in 2003, when you had upwards, in various phases of 250,000 troops. I'd said earlier that the total number of troops right now deployed, U.S. troops throughout the whole region, dispersed on ships and bases, is 50,000. So that is a relatively, it sounds like a lot of troops, and it is, but it's a relatively small number when you take it against the number of troops that have been deployed in full-scale big ground invasions in the past. I think what most military experts looking on will agree on is even at a small number, even at a larger number, ground operations almost by definition are dangerous. They are risky. They pose, risk to the troops obviously engaged in them. But let's also take it in the context of an Iran which has, even with diminished weapon potential, diminished munitions, has been able to remain very resilient and very defiant. And with the weapons it does have left, has been able to use them tactically with quite a bit of precision, perhaps more than the Pentagon and Donald Trump's military planners had anticipated. So those ground forces, if and how they are used, whether it's Karg Island, whether it's to get uranium from stocks from underground, or some other mission, they presumably could be potentially exposed to a lot of very lethal Iranian incoming fire.
Doug, thank you for that. France 24's Doug Herbert. Well, Iran's Speaker of Parliament has said its forces are waiting for American soldiers after the Pentagon announced that arrival of 3,500 sailors and Marines to the Middle East. The Washington Post, meanwhile, is reporting military officials are preparing options for those ground operations in Iran. We're going to talk more about this now with security expert Michael Knights, who joins me from Boston. Welcome, Michael. We just heard Doug there a moment ago talk about the big picture when it comes to this potential military action. Can you give us an idea from your expertise of what these various operations of the U.S. and Iran could be?
Thanks very much for having me. And Doug didn't leave a lot unsaid. For a non-military expert, he really knows his stuff. I think he's very correct when he says that the additional U.S. Marines and Special Operations Forces are there to give the U.S. options to do some very special, quite large-scale missions. That doesn't mean marching on Tehran, as he said. It doesn't even mean holding multiple Iranian cities. But it might mean holding all the Iranian controlled islands in the Gulf, around the Strait of Hormuz. It might also include taking over some key Iranian facilities for a short period of time to try and evacuate some nuclear materials or introduce international inspectors even. But Iran still maintains a very high quality, very large military capability, even a month into this war, because they're basically a larger military opponent than the US has taken on in the last 20 years. And it takes a lot of time to wear down the military stocks and capabilities of that kind of enemy.
Just sketch it out for us. I mean, what would it mean really for the U.S. to use its troops to try and do something like take Karg Island like Donald Trump has threatened?
Taking the islands, not necessarily the hard part. When you focus the attention of the U.S. military on seizing even a large island like Karg Island, you tend to achieve your objectives. You take some casualties, small number in the single digits or tens of US fatalities, but you actually take the location. The problem then is that you are garrisoning a location just off the Iranian coast, underneath the threat radius of all of these Iranian drone missile systems, etc. So it becomes a very miserable existence for the troops who are trying to garrison that location. And that's when you take a constant dribble of casualties. So, that's the difficulty there with an in and out operation to seize highly enriched uranium. Nobody has ever done this before in a contested environment where somebody might be trying to stop you from getting that very sensitive, very noxious material out of the country. And nobody's ever done it at facilities that might be partially collapsed under the ground due to our earlier bombings, where it might not be easy to access those materials immediately.
So Iran, for its part, says it will rain fire on U.S. troops if they do come in. Can they do that? Are they capable of doing that? Talk us through Iran's defense strategy.
Yes, Iran had a very deep arsenal of missiles, rockets, and drone systems, the same way that Lebanese Hezbollah did before Israel undertook a quite thorough destruction of their assets last year. We're still at an earlier stage in Iran. They still have thousands of large, medium, and short-range ballistic missiles and anti-shipping missiles, and they still have tens of thousands of smaller drone, long-range rocket systems, and naval mines, plus around 1 million men under arms in their overall mobilization. So it's still a very large military, and it prevents you from doing anything with 10, 20,000 additional troops on the ground in mainland Iran. You have to kind of peck around the edges, and you will be under fire the whole time. The Iranians finally have also, hit upon the very useful tactic of not striking directly back only at the Americans and the Israelis, but striking at global shipping and striking at the very vulnerable Gulf states on the other side of the Gulf.
Michael, Iran's defense strategy has been described as what we call a mosaic strategy, something that's been developed for decades. Just break that down for us. What does that mean exactly?
What it means is that for 5 decades now, they've been watching the US undertake operations in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, the initial invasion operations, and they've been watching the US do things like the Maduro raid and other kind of specific counterterrorism successes. And they've said, how can we avoid the same outcome? And as a result, what they've done is to decentralize defense decision-making within various regions inside Iran, and they've mixed together a variety of high-tech and low-tech military systems to make it difficult to do a knockout blow against Iran's military, either the command or the actual ground-level forces, by dispersing them, by having a combination of missiles, drones, landmines, ground forces, naval mines, and other forces. So, it's a very difficult target to suppress fully. And, unlike Israel, that's sitting right next to Lebanese Hezbollah and can physically invade, as it is again at this moment, the US is not really postured to do that anymore. We're not going to do another Iraq 2003 again.
Michael, thank you for that. That's security expert Michael Knights. Thanks so much for sharing your expertise.